Welcome Year 12 Bio. Today we're going to be taking a look at pathogens and how they cause infectious disease. Let's get into it, people. Alright, so this is part of the video lectures on Module 7 where we're going to be looking at the first inquiry question, how are diseases transmitted? Alright, and that's for the first topic, the causes of infectious disease. All right, so let's start off by defining what we mean when we say pathogen. Now, infectious diseases, they are normally caused by the spread of a pathogen, all right, usually some sort of microbe or viral particle coming into contact with a host. And there's a variety of ways in which these particles can actually come into contact. All right, but often as part of their infection process, what they will do is they will concentrate in the body fluids of the infected host, and they will take advantage of the immune response of the infected person to actually spread through coughing and sneezing and other body fluids getting around in the environment to be picked up by new hosts. All right, now, in order for a pathogen to cause a disease, it has to be present in a large enough quantity, all right, to actually affect the host. It has to be able to get into the host from another body, all right, and survive the body's natural defenses. And most importantly, it needs to be able to survive transmission between hosts. Okay, so if it is actually outside of the body for an extended period of time or on the surface, maybe on a door handle or on a tabletop, all right, or on a railing, it needs to be able to survive in the environment. And some common examples of the microorganisms and viral particles that we talk about, we have parasites, so tapeworms, protozoa such as malaria, fungi, which causes athlete's foot, and prokaryotes or bacteria, all right, that cause a variety of diseases such as leprosy, as well as viral particles which cause things like HIV, and one which people might not be familiar with, but we have prions or infectious proteins that cause things like mad cow disease. Okay, so we have multiple different types of pathogens, and there's 7 main types you need to focus on, although I do have a couple of additional ones in my lesson materials which you can find on Moodle, all right, which are a bit more focused on plants. All right, we have viruses. These are tiny packages of a protein coating surrounding genetic material, either RNA or DNA, and their whole purpose is to actually, for that particle to get that genetic material into the inside a cell and take over the machinery of the cell for the production of genetic material and the production of proteins to actually manufacture more viral particles. And from there, one of 2 things happen. Either there is a assembling of more and more viral particles until the cell lyses and explodes, and spreading out more particles to infect new cells, or it actually becomes a kind of like a little factory that actually encapsulates the viral particles in vesicles and sends them back out through the cell membrane. All right, diseases that are caused by viruses include HIV, influenza, all right, genital warts, the whole range of diseases. All right, we also have a bunch of infectious diseases that are caused by bacteria. And these basically result from bacteria that is either not meant to be in our bodies, getting into our bodies and getting where they shouldn't be, or bacteria that is part of our natural ecosystem of bacteria actually getting their population out of control, all right, and producing toxins or something like that, and actually causing a variety of issues. Diseases that are caused by bacteria include Staph aureus, chlamydia, gonorrhea, and TB. All right, there's a range of different diseases that are caused by that. They're typically treated by deployment of antibiotics or intervention, medical intervention with antibiotics if possible. We have prions, which might be a new one to some people. This is very similar to viruses. They're not a cellular pathogen. They're actually can be viewed as being an infectious protein. All right. And mad cow disease, or bovine spongiform endopathy, all right, is a really common example of one that affects cows and other livestock, all right, and actually causes a degenerative brain disease where it puts plaques on the neurons and has a number of really negative effects that are actually really similar to Alzheimer's. And there's believed to be some link between mad cow disease and Alzheimer's. Alrighty. We have fungi, which are single and multi-celled plants. And, so yeast infections, athlete's foot, ringworm, not actually caused by a worm. All right. If they're growing in the wrong spot, they can cause issues. We have parasitic worms or helminths. All right. They're pretty straightforward. All right. Hookworms, tapeworms, liver flukes. All right. They get into you. It's part of their reproductive cycle to actually use you as a nice, comfy place to actually produce more eggs that get back out into the environment. We'll talk more on them in a few slides. We have protozoa. Remember that protozoa is kind of a dumping ground for any single-celled organisms that don't fit fungi or bacteria. Okay, and these include protozoa that cause Giardia, Toxoplasmosis, all right, and malaria and so forth. So quite a range of diseases, and some like malaria, which we've already covered in year 11. We have ectoparasites. These are complex organisms that usually survive on the skin of a host. All right, these include fleas, ticks, lice, and so forth. All right, just repeating myself, there's additional information on some plant pathogens in the notes just for you to review. All right, now with those types of parasites, one of the things you need to understand is that they're organisms that have evolved to infect and survive inside of other organisms or on the surface of other organisms. So that means they need other organisms for their nutrition, their shelter, and for their reproduction. All right, they're parasites. And there's actually an interesting situation where you have this back and forth between the host animal or the host plant and the pathogen that is actually causing the disease that affects the host. All right, this war of adaptations that are occurring for either getting entry to cause disease, all right, and enable reproduction, or blocking, putting up barriers and finding ways to stop the pathogens from getting into the cells of the host. All right, and so pathogens themselves, as part of their evolution, have actually developed a number of interesting adaptations that enable them to get entry into body tissue of their hosts. All right, and these are adaptations that enable them to transmit from one host to another. All right, these include vectors, such as other organisms, to actually transport the pathogen from one host to another. Mosquitoes with malaria is actually a very good example of that. So mosquitoes actually carry the protozoa that causes malaria. All right, and when they have a blood meal from a person, if they're infected with the protozoa, they actually pass that to the human they are feeding themselves on. They'll be an example of an ectoparasite. All right, single-celled organisms, to be able to get into body tissue, they need to be able to move around, or they need to be able to break down barriers. And so you have flagella, all right, on the outside of their cell membranes to actually enable movement in the case of some bacteria and some protozoa, and you have enzymes to break down the chemical barriers that are put up by hosts and so forth. All right, you also have variation in the molecules on the surface on the surface of the pathogen cells and the pathogen particles. All right, these are called antigens, and they're to actually avoid the host recognition upon secondary exposure. All right, one of the really cool things about the response of many organisms to infectious agents or pathogens is that they're able to actually identify particles that are not meant to be present. Okay, and that's kind of cool. All right, and we'll look into that when we look at immune responses a little bit later on. But it's pretty cool that our bodies can basically look at a cell or a particle and go, hey, are you meant to be here? All right, and we'll look into the immune response because it's really, really cool. And then, of course, there are biofilms. And these are a way in which bacteria usually survive as a form of colony. All right, so they can form a film across a surface. The outside of the colony may be able to get killed by the host or antibiotics or something like that. But the dead cells of the bacteria actually protect the bacteria that is in the inner part of the biofilm, and that's actually a real problem with medical equipment and actually sterilizing medical equipment. We'll look in. Alrighty, so it's one of those sort of things that protect. A lot of engineering is involved in the correct sterilizing of medical equipment. All right, so moving on. I wanted to take a moment just to really drive home the complex life cycle of many pathogens. Okay. And so here we have the life cycle of tapeworms, courtesy of an image from the CDC. And what we can see is that it's picked up in the environment by cows and pigs ingesting the vegetation that is contaminated with the eggs of the tapeworms. It develops into a dormant cyst in the muscle tissue of those animals, which, when it is consumed by humans, can actually pose a real risk to humans if the meat is raw or undercooked. All right, again, this is part of the reason where heat treatment of food is actually really important, so more on that later. All right, there it develops into the adult form worm in our intestines and undergoes its reproductive cycle. All right, that can be sexual or asexual, depending on the worm. All right, and then it produces eggs, all right, which are then spread back into the environment through the feces of the human. All right, and eventually they make their way back into vegetation that enables them to be picked up by livestock animals. And so we have one horrific example. Kind of doesn't make you want to eat bacon, does it? Alrighty, so we have also, if we take a look at malaria, okay, so this is a protozoa. All right, malaria is caused by a protozoa. It has a really complex life cycle, as you would have noted in year 11 when you did your depth study assessment task. Okay, and what actually happens there is you have a mosquito vector taking bringing the protozoa into contact with humans, and multiple life stages in different parts of our anatomy, all right, being the liver and the blood, all right, two key points, all right. And so that actually, just be mindful that has a rather interesting and complex life cycle that you should be aware of. All right, this one I actually want to spend a bit of time on, which is Toxoplasma gondii. This is a single-celled organism, okay? And in most cases, if things are going well for this particular parasite, all right, what it actually does is it wants to get into a rat or a mouse, okay? Because rats and mice have a behavioral adaptation where if they smell cat pee or cat urine, okay, they go away from it. All right. What Toxo does, all right, is it actually messes with the reward pathway of the mice and causes them to run toward the cats. Cats love it, obviously, because they get a free meal. All right. And the toxo itself, which is the short name for Toxoplasma gondii, anything truly horrific needs to have a cute name, right? All right. So toxo itself gets to, once the rat gets eaten, gets to reproduce in the intestines of the cat, which is its goal. Now, that sounds horrific, because it is horrific. But one of the things that's actually really fascinating about this whole cycle is that it's possible for the cysts that are actually formed as part of the reproductive cycle of toxo to actually end up in humans through contaminated meat or contaminated water. All right. And it's estimated that something like 1 in 3 people in Western countries actually have toxo cysts in their body and in their brains. All right. And the thing that's really cool, well, horrific, all right, is that people who have that in their brain, there is some evidence, it's not complete, all right, that they actually score slightly differently on personality tests. All right. This is a single-celled organism that affects the brain of multi-celled mammals. That's kind of fascinating that this tiny thing can have such a big impact. All right, and who knows? Maybe the people who have it in their brains, or in most cases, it's dormant, right? So it shouldn't be affecting them. All right, but in some cases, it might explain things like an obsession with having 50 cats. All right, because maybe it's a biological component to that obsession. Alrighty. Now, just changing gears, one of the things from looking at those cellular-based diseases, and in the case of the worms, a multicellular-based parasite, all right, is we see that the life cycle of those particular pathogens actually involves multiple hosts. That's also true of viruses. And this is something very relevant at the moment with the whole coronavirus pandemic that's going on. Okay, and so one of the things that we actually believe has made that particular virus a very bad thing for us is the point that it has jumped from one species. All right, we actually believe it's come from a bushmeat market in China and ended up in humans, mutated to become infectious and be able to be passed from human to human. All right. And so one of the concepts I wanted to introduce to you is that viruses can jump species, and that's kind of how epidemics and pandemics can actually start. And one of the key species that actually spreads viruses around is actually migratory birds. Okay, because they're able to have quite a large range, and so they can come into contact with things like pigs and other animals. All right, and that can enable those migratory birds can come into contact with domestic poultry, and that can bring them into contact with humans. And that's why we see diseases like COVID-19 coming out of, and swine flu and avian flu coming out of communities associated with agriculture. There's a lovely little article I've got linked in the presentation that goes into that in a little bit more academic sense. Worth a read. All right, so let's take a look at some history, specifically germ theory, that actually takes a look at how we actually got to understanding that many infectious diseases are caused by pathogens, that they're caused by tiny microorganisms. And it's the reproduction of that microorganism as part of their own life cycle within a host that is actually causing the disease in that host. Now, prior to this, the leading idea was miasma theory, which the idea is that the vapors from rotting garbage and rotting, decaying material, all right, they actually cause disease such as plague and so forth to be spread. All right, now just remember, this time, they'd had a very incomplete idea of how the world worked. We know these days that having dirty surfaces and can have germs on surfaces that can cause disease and so forth, but at the time they didn't. All right. And kind of one of the really important experiments was actually conducted by Francesco Redi in 1668, which is a very simple experiment. A chunk of meat in a jar, exposed to the atmosphere, flies fly into it, they lay their eggs, maggots form. All right. If we have a gauze-covered jar, all right, the flies can't get to it, but they're able to lay their eggs, or the eggs can drop through the gauze down to the meat, and we end up with maggots again on the meat. If we have a sealed jar where no flies can actually get to that meat, we have no maggots forming. So in this case there, all right, Francesco was showing that maggots don't just spontaneously form. All right, they're part of the life cycle of flies. All right, and so that shows us again that there's more going on than just material rotting over time and introducing disease-causing agents to it. All right, now here are some key discoveries that actually led to that whole idea that it is tiny microorganisms that are causing disease, that are so pathogens themselves, recognizing that things like bacteria and parasites are pathogens that are causing disease. We have Louis Pasteur, who noticed that microbes cause the putrefaction or the rotting of food, and that by subjecting samples of food and drinks and stuff like that to heating, you're able to kill the microbes that cause that putrefaction. This led to the heat systems for heat treating of foods, such as milk, which is named after Louis, in terms of pasteurization to destroy microbes and increase shelf life. We have Joseph Lister, who introduced antiseptic, notably through the use of carboxylic acid, all right, into hospital wards. All right, his main point was that if you should clean surfaces, you should clean instruments, and you should clean your hands before you stick them into patients. Smart man. Saved a lot of lives. All right. He faced some opposition when he introduced that, by the way. And we had Robert Koch, who developed a set of criteria to establish whether or not an infectious disease was caused by a particular microbe or pathogenic organism. All right. These criteria are known as Koch's postulates. All right. So the image shown just here gives a breakdown of Louis Pasteur's famous experiment. All right, what he did is he boiled broth. Now, broth, it's not necessarily, if you're not familiar with it, think chicken stock or vegetable stock in boiled water. Lots of nice nutrients for bacteria to munch on. Okay. All right, if you have an open flask, all right, of boiled broth, all right, it's exposed to air, and any bacteria in the air can cause contamination and putrefaction, so rotting to occur. All right, but if you plug the flask with cotton, or you, in the case of Louis, what he did is he heated and he bent the end of the flasks into a extended long neck, all right, to actually make it impossible for viral particles to actually reach the broth. After heat treatment, the broth was able to stay sterile for an extended period of time. Okay. And so what that actually was noticed was that if you're able to remove microbes that cause material to decay and rot from the food, you're able to extend its shelf life. Okay, so that was an important recognition that part of the things that's causing stuff like disease was actually microbes. Another important one was Robert Koch. He developed a set of criteria to actually work out whether or not a particular microorganism or virus or something like that was actually causing a disease. Okay, and so the first question you had to answer for a suspected microorganism was you need to be finding that microorganism present in all organisms that suffer from a particular disease. And so if you're able to isolate the suspected pathogen, okay, in all cases of the diseased animal, then it could be a possible candidate. Then what you would do is you would culture it, okay, in a and grow it and cause it to multiply in a controlled environment. And this is where Koch's work gets a little bit grim. Then you'd take a healthy organism, all right, and I believe he did this with sheep to start with, all right, but it's often done with things like lab mice and stuff like that now, and you infect it with the cultured microorganism and observe and see if the disease reoccurs. If that happens, you've got a strong link showing that your isolated and cultured microorganism is the culprit for your disease, your pathogen. Okay, but you're not done just there. You need to actually isolate the pathogen again from the inoculated, from the infected host, from the second run of hosts, all right, to actually identify it as a potential pathogen. Okay, so we have, it's grim, but it was an important chain of evidence, Koch's postulates for establishing that germs or microbes actually cause many diseases. This enabled people to actually work out that diseases like anthrax, which you're probably familiar with from being like a terrorist poison in a TV show, all right, but it actually affects sheep, all right, as being a bacterium that is found in soil, all right, and then if you're able to actually identify that you have diseased animals on a farm and they're infected with anthrax, you might want to not have those animals in that particular paddock, for example. All right, so that actually has enabled people to have a lot of actual really helpful things. All righty, so today we've taken a look at pathogens. We've taken a look at the different microorganisms and otherwise viral particles that actually cause disease, that actually are pathogens. We have taken a look at the adaptations of pathogens. We've taken a look at germ theory and the scientific discoveries behind it, notably Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch's work. Alrighty, so let's get on with our lesson. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you later.